Okie doke. Right. Red letter day. Trump guilty, 34 counts. We'll get back to that in a moment, but I did prepare a little bit on Rosa Luxemburg, more specifically on the imperialist and what is now called the settler-colonial genocide part of what she sort of represented as in terms of revolutionary activity. And I think we saw pretty clearly yesterday in the biopic the kind of tension between those who would be more, you could call them, they're called revisionists or reformists, or it's hard to call them centrists, but the Social Democratic Party of Germany tended to be very institutional about its position relative to taking over, creating a German republic, first of all. And secondly, trying to, make it consonant with other things. But the problem was, of course, you had a screwed German economy because of war reparations and other matters, and internal strife from a large military, post-military population that, had its own right-wing militancy, which ultimately wound up, giving us the rise of Nazism, et cetera. For all the kind of integrated reasons, that is, you have the undercurrent of anti-Semitism and a whole bunch of other things that are part of the history of Germany, or history of Germany and Austria, and that's all kind of there. And you have all these things working at the same time. You have a very strong left that is trying to figure out, well, I think we can take over the government, and they sort of keep trying to do it, and they don't quite fully do it, and that's why you had more radical solutions being argued for, and that's kind of what the Spartacists that Luxemburg represents in terms of the German Communist Party. It's at the KPD as opposed to the SPD, which still exists and in fact is the ruling party currently in the unified Germany. After many decades in the wilderness in East Germany. So today in This and That, we're following up a little bit more on the Rosa Luxemburg Reader, edited by Peter Hudis and Kevin Anderson. And I'll read through this fairly quickly. It's a very short review done in HNet, which is the listserv for historians on the internet. Anyway, the book is the Rosa Luxemburg Reader. It's a 2004 Monthly Review Press, and Jennifer Benner is the reviewer, and has a few criticisms of the text, but includes in her review a couple of the more important points, and that's why colonialism comes up, and I just wanted to make some suggestions connected to that, and then we could stop or go back to news coverage on the Trump verdict. Rosa Luxemburg composed her last essay, Order Reigns in Berlin, in hiding after the failed Spartacus uprising of 1919. In it, she wrote, "The revolution has no time to lose. It storms forward, past still open graves, past victories and defeats toward its great goals. To follow lucidly its principles and its paths is the first task of the fighters for international socialism." The texts gathered in the Rosa Luxemburg Reader show precisely the exemplary way in which Luxemburg fulfilled her own counsel, analyzing, theorizing, and participating in the principles and paths of revolutionary social democracy was Luxemburg's life work. And born in Poland in 1871, one of the most important activists and theorists of the socialist movement in Eastern and Central Europe until she was murdered in 1919 by the right-wing Freikorps. For those familiar with Luxemburg primarily through social reform or revolution, her critique of the reformed socialist Edward Bernstein, we saw in the biopic last night how she really disliked the guy. The Rosa Luxemburg Reader is a welcome addition to the literature. Its editors have collected writings that represent Luxemburg's major works and her thinking on such diverse topics as primitive communism, imperialism, revolutionary practice, women's suffrage, the Russian revolutions, and World War I, some appearing in English for the first time. Within each of the book's 5 sections, individual writings are introduced with a short editorial note that includes the original publication date or delivery, if a speech, translator, and a brief synopsis of the work's content and the context of its production. Translations are taken from previous English publications of the material where possible. New translations are primarily provided by Anderson and Ashley Passmore. The 23-page introduction gives a useful overview of Luxemburg's life and work by sketching out the historical background, reception, and the key arguments of her major works. In the discussion of the volume's contents, the authors highlight the significance of Luxemburg's theories and political stances, some of which they've argued have been overlooked or misidentified by previous scholars. And above all, they attempt to demonstrate Luxemburg's continuing relevance for contemporary activists and thinkers in the age of global capital. They argue that Luxemburg was ahead of her time in recognizing the links between capitalism, imperialism, and permanent war, a critique that continues to resonate. Indeed, Udison and Anderson have chosen selections well to make their argument. In the nearly 400 pages of Luxemburg's writings gathered here, one is continually impressed by the critical and passionate spirit with which she approaches issues ranging from parliamentary politics to mass strikes to the plight of colonized peoples. Particularly striking is the prescience of her analysis and how germane it is to issues in our own time. And the significant section is on her major work, The Accumulation of Capital, where she argues that Marx failed to consider fully the inevitable expansion of capitalist reproduction to non-capitalist societies. This is during the age of imperialism, the golden age, as it were. As the editors point out in an endnote, English versions of the text have routinely omitted Luxemburg's original subtitle, A Contribution to an Explanation of Imperialism. Selections from the book are well chosen to demonstrate the originality and continued relevance, namely that capitalism is compelled to find new markets outside the industrialized world, and that imperialism and the violent exploitation of colonized peoples go hand in hand with capitalist expansion. Luxemburg makes an explicit comparison between the disposition of medieval European peasants and the destructive power of modern colonial policy. As it did in Europe, capitalism destroys traditional social units and economic ties through the only solution available to it, namely force. Also included are selections from Luxemburg's unfinished Introduction to Political Economy, which I discussed the other day, where she discusses primitive communism, that is pre-slavery, pre-feudal communism, and slavery, a recently discovered text published here for the first time in English. This section concludes with an impassioned newspaper article written shortly after the destructive volcanic eruption in the French colony of Martinique. Luxemburg pulls no punches in exposing the hypocrisy of European nations who rush to help victims of natural disasters who have already suffered the disaster of colonialism at the hands of their would-be saviors. Interestingly, she includes the suppression of uprisings in Poland and France in this critique, essentially equating the proletariat with the colonized. A short piece like this is an instructive contrast to Luxemburg's more technical writings and might also serve as a valuable teaching text. The second section on the politics of revolution includes selections from the published work Social Reform of the Revolution, 1889, and The Mass Strike, the Political Party, and the Trade Unions, 1906, as well as short speeches and articles. Reform or Revolution is Luxemburg's spirited critique of Edward Bernstein and arguably her most familiar work. Bernstein called for a reappraisal of Marxist theories and further argued that the strength of workers' unions meant that the proletariat could eventually achieve its goals through parliamentary means. For Luxemburg, the question reform or revolution concerned the very existence of the social democratic movement. Defending Marx, Luxemburg argues that reforms pursued for their own ends through bourgeoisie parliamentarianism are merely surface modifications that can never substitute for the revolutionary transformation of the social order. In her writings on mass strikes and other forms of political action, Luxemburg again takes on the more conservative elements of social democracy, many of which considered revolutionary action in Russia premature. Those are the fundamental issues that in the early Russian Revolution were incredibly problematic, and of course resulted in the, as it were, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Part 2 also includes pieces collected under the title Writings on Women. Luxemburg's critical stance towards bourgeois feminism is well known, but it has often been interpreted as indifference or even enmity towards feminist goals. One of the strengths of this volume is the measures that Hudis and Anderson take to correct this perception. The editors include 4 short pieces here, only one of which has been previously published in English. In A Tactical Question, Luxemburg blasts the Belgian Social Democrats for dropping women's suffrage from their platform in order to form a parliamentary coalition with the liberals. The 1912 speech, Women's Suffrage and Class Struggle, demonstrates how essential Luxemburg considered the political enfranchisement of proletarian women to the goals of socialism. Luxemburg places a women's emancipation in the context of revolutionary socialism and is utterly dismissive of collaboration with bourgeois women, who she calls parasites of the social body. Her attitude here does not constitute hostility to feminism. Rather, it is reflective of her refusal to endanger the goals of social democracy through cooperation with the liberal bourgeoisie. Democracy for Luxemburg meant that all voices must be heard, and she saw the empowerment of women's voices as a necessary catalyst for revolution. In their introduction, the editors addressed the important question of how Luxemburg earned a reputation for indifference to the woman question. Is it that her contemporaries and her historians expected from her a, quote, more overt engagement with feminism because she was a woman? Luxemburg herself consciously avoided such connections. As the Marxist and feminist scholar Raya Dunayevskaya writes, Luxemburg rightly refused to be pigeonholed by the German social democracy into the so-called woman question, as if that were the only place she belonged. The selections in Part 2 from Theory and Practice, Luxemburg's 1910 response to Karl Kautsky. We saw Karl Kautsky represented last night in the movie, who had refused to publish an essay of hers on the mass strike. We saw that particular event, in fact, last night. Deserves mention here because of a rather problematic endnote included by the editors. Luxemburg refers to Trotha's victory over the Hottentot women and children in the Kalahari. Now, this is really nitpicking and ostensibly a typo, but it's important. I mean, all editors need to be held accountable. The endnote connected to this sentence mistakenly places the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples of German Southwest Africa, that is present-day Namibia, in the early 19th century, whereas it's really in the early 20th century. That's actually very important because it's a contemporary event, an event contemporary to Luxemburg, and important because it is that moment in the couple of decades after the so-called Great Scramble, when Africa gets divided up by the European powers. Germany was not a significant. I get this from Wikipedia. This is from this first paragraph is from the Smithsonian. The second couple of paragraphs are from Wikipedia. They're just for historical background, but I think it's important to recall that of all the things that we were looking at in prior readings, whether it was from the Caribbean or from Algeria, etc., we know that the issue of settler colonialism is a very continuous one in the last century and continues still to this day. Incredibly problematic as a structural problem, particularly with the rise of analysis of indigenous peoples. Germany was not a significant player in the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century and early 20th century, during which the imperial powers of Europe carved up the continent for resources and power. Recalled all the stuff that we've looked at in earlier versions of this place in discussions of the Belgian Congo. The empire arrived late to the game, and did not have the sizable navy of countries like Portugal, the United Kingdom, or the Netherlands. Nevertheless, it still established colonial German Southwest Africa and German East Africa, weirdly connected, of course. By 1914, it occupied more than 1 million square miles of territory. That's a heck of a lot of territory. I include this little map here of how Africa was partitioned in the pre-World War I period, 1885 to 1914. It's an important, a critical era, not only for the rise of American industrial power and financial power, but also European expansion into colonial areas that are incredibly problematic. And I'll point why that is in a moment here. So you can see the division among European powers of Africa as colonial. And you see only really one independent or two independent areas, Liberia, because it was resettled by American slaves, ostensibly, and Abyssinia, with Haile Selassie, Ethiopia, et cetera, et cetera. But the German holdings are down in here. Cameroon is German, which borders French Equatorial Africa. And you have German East Africa here, which has a weird kind of little connector, much like Palestine, to German Southwest Africa. So you have interesting connections. And so I came across this where, not unlike the Belgians, the story of Belgium with the Congo, similarly, German colonies were connected to German ports like Hamburg or Bremen. And so there's actually, there's a colonial connection that is kind of interesting. And fairly recently, actually, you have some, you could call them revisionist, I suppose, sort of retconning the German colonial past. And so there's an exhibition called Bremen and the Art of the Colonial Period, and preceded by the three words, the blind spot. And that's this interesting idea of Germans beginning to look at its own colonial responsibilities as a kind of blind spot in its own history, acknowledging, of course, all of its other imperial kind of interests. Ethnologists are conducting research all over Germany, more or less unnoticed by the public, and networks have existed for decades with communities in the countries of origin, but never before has it been transparent to visitors how that time went, who was interested in bringing the objects to Germany, and how interwoven the mentality was with everyday life. Never before has a German art museum approached colonial history in such a differentiated way. I will make as an aside point that in art history, for example, the dominance of German scholarship is really important in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I won't go through an extensive lecture on that, but German scholarship is incredibly important. But as it moves further, it includes, of course, colonial interests. Germans bring back artwork, and such artwork is framed as "quote unquote" primitive. And so the model of primitivism in art history is kind of framed within the context of German scholarship, and is always centered on interpretations of objects with sort of lacking their anthropological background. There's very little field work connected to that, as a result of ostensibly colonial plunder. And it's not unimportant because various theoretical arguments are made about sort of it is the barbarism versus humanity sort of stuff. It has within it a certain a kind of psychologism and cultural hegemony and if needless to say, racism built into the interpretation. So you can look at this. There's a literature for this, and if you're amused by it, it's actually pretty important because it sort of gets to the root of how we think about modernist abstraction in art in the 20th century, in terms of framing it in various discourses that include this issue of what counts as the quote unquote savage mind, which you see referenced in other anthropological literature. Bremen is the perfect place for this. The city's merchants, also often important patrons of cultural life, played a key role in the colonization of West and Southwest Africa. Even after the end of the First World War, the Bremen Committee of the Reich Association of Colonial Germans, this is all about the Second Reich, and we'll get to that in a moment, movement demanded the return of German territories overseas, and under the National Socialists, Bremen became the city of colonies. The Kunsthalle itself emerged directly from the new wealth created by colonialism. It was founded by merchants in 1823 and now houses an outstanding collection from the 14th century to the present day. And this is talking about this particular exhibition. It weaves historical documents and relics into this picture through art, an old school map advertising the German colonies of the time, then a poster from the Bremen Reich Association of Colonial Germans asking for signatures. It shows a black boy with a palm frond and underneath a call. We demand colonies because every people has the right and the duty to work towards the spread of morality and culture, truth and justice, and towards the extraction of the earth's goods. Kind of all there. All imperialism all the time. So this end note is where I got to, because I sort of wanted to look up and see exactly, you could say, and you could argue for, and I think you can see the literature that argues for this. And yes, it's not the only literature, it's not even the dominant literature, but it shows a kind of through line between the Holocaust and the genocide done in Africa. So you know, it you can say that it's problematic and how many connections were there, but you know, it's within the generation, a subsequent colonial generation. And so I would assert to you, if you're engaging in settler colonial discourse, that you can make these connections. And there's a history that is sort of unattended to in a lot of, you know, it's there. The history's always been there. It's just never been sort of focused on as, oh, yeah, well, there's a certain continuity going on. So between 24,000 and 100,000 Hereros and 10,000 Nama were killed in the genocide. The first phase of the genocide was characterized by widespread death from starvation and dehydration, sounds familiar, due to the prevention of the Herero from leaving the Namib Desert by German forces. Once defeated, thousands of Hereros and Namas were imprisoned in concentration camps where the majority died of diseases, abuse, and exhaustion. Remember, this is before World War I. In May 2021, the German government issued an official statement in which it said that Germany apologizes and bows before the descendants of the victims. Today, more than 100 years later, Germany asks for forgiveness for the sins of their forefathers. It is not possible to undo what has been done, but the suffering, inhumanity, and pain inflicted on the tens of thousands of innocent men, women, and children by Germany during the war in what is now Namibia must not be forgotten. It must serve as a warning against racism and genocide. Furthermore, the German government agreed to pay 1.1 billion euros over 30 years to fund projects in communities that were impacted by the genocide. Both German colonial authorities and European settlers envisioned a predominantly white new African Germany, wherein the native populations would be put onto reservations and their land distributed among settlers and companies. Under German colonial rule, colonists were encouraged to seize land and cattle from the native Herero and Nama peoples and to subjugate them as slave laborers. In 1900, Kaiser Wilhelm II had been enraged by the killing of Baron Clemens von Kettler, the Imperial German minister plenipotentiary in Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion. The Kaiser took it as a personal insult from the people he viewed as racially inferior, all the more because of his obsession with the yellow peril, quote unquote, of the time. On 27 July 1900, the Kaiser gave the infamous Hunnenrede, Hun speech in Bremerhaven to German soldiers being sent to Imperial China, ordering them to show the Boxers no mercy and to behave like Attila's Huns. General von Trotha had served in China and was chosen in 1904 to command the expedition to German Southwest Africa, precisely because of his record in China. This is the same thing as Chinese Gordon, remember, in Khartoum, etc. In 1904, the Kaiser was furious by the latest revolt in his colonial empire by a people whom he also viewed as inferior, and took the Herero rebellion as a personal insult, just as he had viewed the Boxer's assassination of Baron von Kettler. The tactless and bloodthirsty language that Wilhelm II used about the Herero people in 1904 is strikingly similar to the language he had used about the Chinese Boxers in 1900. However, the Kaiser denied, together with Chancellor von Bülow, von Trotha's request to quickly quell the rebellion. The Herero genocide has commanded the attention of historians who study complex issue of continuity between the Herero genocide and the Holocaust. It is argued that the Herero genocide set a precedent in Imperial Germany that would later be followed by Nazi Germany's establishment of death camps. And then I put in a paragraph here about the return of remains and reparations relative to Namibia. And that's very similar to the same issue of indigenous peoples and slave remains in the United States being held by academics. And this little side note, in case Bruce is listening, Thomas Pynchon's novel V had a chapter that included recollections of the genocide. Their memories of events that took place in 1904 in various locations, including the Shark Island concentration camp. And so I'll show a few minutes from a BBC documentary on the Second Reich and Namibia's genocide.
Today, the grandchildren of those who survived the Namibian genocide have begun to fight for compensation and for Germany to acknowledge the first genocide of the 20th century, the genocide of the Second Reich. The story begins in 1884, as delegates from all the great powers of Europe gathered in the grand imperial capital of the German Reich, Berlin. They met to carve up an entire continent. Germany did well out of the scramble for Africa, taking full control of Togo, Cameroon, German East Africa, and German Southwest Africa. But just as Germany was beginning her imperial project, new theories were sweeping across Europe that were to have a powerful influence upon that new empire. Some of the most influential were those of a now-forgotten geographer called Friedrich Ratzel.
Friedrich Ratzel was a late 19th, early 20th century German geographer who taught at the University of Leipzig, and he is most famous today for having created Lebensraum theory, the idea that a people or nation must have space, and increasing space as they grow, in order to survive and prosper.
In his book Anthropogeography, Ratzel argued that some of the living space, or Lebensraum, that Germany needed could be found in her new African colonies. And the ideas of men like Ratzel found a ready audience at the time, because behind the grandeur of the Second Reich, Germany's cities had a terrible secret. A population boom had left millions trapped in overcrowded slums and filthy tenements. Berlin itself had become a byword for urban poverty. The German poor had become the Volk ohne Raum, the people without space. And the poor were voting with their feet. During the 1870s, 1.25 million Germans had chosen to leave and become Americans. Seen through Ratzel's Lebensraum theory, Germany now faced the choice of declining through lack of space and the loss of her population, or expanding into new lands. If she could settle her new African colonies with German farmers, these lands would become satellite states that would spread the German race across the world. A greater Second Reich would emerge, stronger and healthier. But only one of Germany's African colonies seemed to offer any real potential for the settlement of farmers and their families. Namibia, or as it was called then, German Southwest Africa. Friedrich Ratzel and other supporters of imperialism promoted Southwest Africa as an ideal source of Lebensraum. It was mainly free of tropical disease, and although much of it was desert, there were huge tracts of land suitable for farming cattle. But by 1903, only 4,000 German settlers had favored Southwest Africa over New York. One reason for the slow pace of colonization was that the land was already the living space of the local African peoples. If the Volk-ohne Raum were to find living space in Southwest Africa, like colonists elsewhere, they would have to take that land from the Africans. The best land in the colony belonged to a formidable people called the Herero.
The Herero of central Namibia had been in contact with the outside world since the early 1800s. They had wagons, their ox wagons. They had a whole section of the society which could read and write. They were extremely well armed with the latest in firearms. These people were not people who were out of
Powerful leaders of the Herero and the colony's other tribes. But for many of the settlers who came to German Southwest Africa, the power and influence of the Africans was completely at odds with the racial theories they had brought with them from Europe, and they resented it.
For the settlers that came here, it would have been an unbearable situation, because the reality of Namibia was that they didn't own the land nor the resources. So you have this very strange, almost paradoxical colonial situation where the colonizer comes in and has to rent land and buy cattle from the people he's supposed to be colonizing.
The issue of who was to own the land created huge tensions between the German settlers and the Africans. But what also began to push the two groups towards conflict was that many settlers were so convinced of their own racial supremacy, they began to believe they could treat the Africans with impunity.
Normal Herero people were being made to work for Germans, and they had virtually no recourse to the law to protect themselves when they were abused. So there are very few cases in which Herero people even tried to seek legal redress when they were not paid, when they were beaten, when they were raped, or when someone in their family was killed.
The reputation of German colonial soldiers when it came to the abuse of African women was so bad that it even became known back in Germany, as seen in this newspaper cartoon strip. And as the news of each murder and rape spread among the Herero, they became convinced that they had no option but to resist. They could see that the German settlers were determined to take their land, and to defend it, they began to consider rebellion.
The German settlers want more and more land. They want land, they want it cheaply, and they want it now. And the German soldiers see themselves as the future settlers. They want to become settlers once they've finished their military service. And you have a situation where the German settlers and the German soldiers find one another in the desire for land. And they are opposed in this by Theodor Leutwein, the governor, and by the Herero.
By Christmas 1903, the capital Windhoek was alive with rumors. In the bars, settlers and their allies in the army openly called for a war against the Herero. Governor Leutwein was now the only force in the colony preventing war. But at the exact moment when his cool head was most needed, a minor revolt in the south meant that he and most of the garrison left. The results were disastrous. Within weeks of the governor's departure, the extremists in the army finally pushed the Herero too far. They rose up, and terrible scores were settled as the relatives of Herero, raped or killed by Germans, took their revenge. In the first few days, over 100 German soldiers and farmers were killed. But the rebellion provided the perfect pretext for the most radical among the settlers and the army to take over the land. They now set about the grim work of ethnically cleansing the colony of the Herero. But there was a problem. Not all the Herero had rebelled. In fact, the rebellion of January 1904 was relatively localized at first, centering around the northern town of Okahanja. Elsewhere, the Herero were just going about their normal lives. To achieve their aim of taking the land, the settlers and the army had to drag the whole Herero nation into the rebellion and transform it into a race war. The story of what happened in the tiny Herero town of Ochimbingwe shows, but in 1904 it was an important Herero center. The Hereros of Ochimbingwe had close links with the community of German settlers with whom they shared the town. 3 days before the outbreak of fighting in the north, the German settlers here gathered to celebrate a wedding. But that evening, a messenger arrived bringing news that the Herero at Okahanja were on the brink of rebellion. Rather than panic, the missionaries of Ochimbingwe instead met with the Herero chief Zacharias, who declared his peaceful intentions. He even wrote a letter to Governor Leutwein, declaring his loyalty to Germany. But the next evening, a group of German soldiers arrived in the town with food and ammunition. During the following days, the white population from the whole area began to abandon their farms and gather in Ochimbingwe. And with each new arrival came a new story of the death and destruction that was sweeping across the colony. As their fears increased, the white population began to fortify a complex of farm buildings belonging to the Halbich family. The Herero, meanwhile, held their normal Sunday service. As their hymns rang out across the town, the German soldiers, only meters away, paced out the range of their field of fire. Barbed wire was strung around the building, and firing holes made in the walls of the Halbich station. On the 23rd of January, just 9 days after the start of the uprising at Okahanja, the German troops finally opened fire. Despite all their demonstrations of loyalty, the Herero of Ochimbingwe were swept into a war they didn't want, against a German community amongst whom they had lived peacefully for years.
So I think that gives you a sense of his history. That there was a link between the Herero and the genocide and the Holocaust, but such a statement demands more evidence and contextualization, and indeed more than the format of an endnote allows. And so, while several historians have compared these two events, Hoodis and Anderson do not cite any of these studies or indicate that the issue remains controversial. As it stands, their note makes a highly provocative but unsupported statement. This endnote, like the others, provides useful historical context, but in this particular case, it's simply inappropriate, especially considering that the reader is intended for a general audience. And so that's that little aside that I wanted to build into that, because in fact, it is an interesting argument and a problematic historiographic one. And so I'll finish off the review here of the third and fourth sections. Third section covers Luxemburg's analysis of Russian social democracy, including excerpts from the unfinished Russian Revolution of 1918. What stands out here is Luxemburg's insistence that revolutionary action cannot conform to any predetermined plan or formula, and that socialism is not a movement of politicians, but of the working class. In her critique of Lenin's organizational policies, Luxemburg emphasizes that the socialist movement must remain ready to incorporate spontaneous worker actions. These selections demonstrate Luxemburg's anger and disappointment with German social democracy. The Russian Revolution also reinforces Luxemburg's unwavering commitment to democracy, which she saw as the necessary twin of socialism. Speaking directly to Trotsky and Lenin, whom she also praises, Luxemburg argues that however problematic democracy may be in practice, the solution lies in more democracy, not less. In the fourth section, we find the Unionist pamphlet, The Crisis in German Social Democracy, and several short pieces collected under the title Speeches and Letters on War and Revolution, 1918 to 19, including Order Reigns in Berlin. The Unionist pamphlet was written in 1915 while Luxemburg was in prison for opposing World War I, and it contains a stinging critique of the SPD for its capitulation to liberal and militarist interests in the lead up to war. Luxemburg considered the SPD's support for war credits to be nothing less than the betrayal of the working class by its own party. Of Germany, once the vanguard of international social democracy, she writes, nowhere was the organization of the proletariat made so completely subservient to imperialism. This text powerfully demonstrates the centrality of imperialism to Luxemburg's analysis of capitalism. She always remains a harsh critic of imperialist practices, especially war, which she contends are inexorably linked to capitalist expansion. In her analysis, European World War reveals the hypocrisy of the imperialist civilizing mission, as Europe itself suffers the total destruction that capitalism and imperialism have already wrought on foreign soil. Luxemburg concludes the pamphlet with a lament for the tremendous loss which the international socialist movement has suffered, writing that 9/10 of these millions dead came from the ranks of the working class. In addition to foreshadowing the split in the SPD party, the Unionist pamphlet offers an impassioned analysis of World War I, written at the moment it was becoming clear just how deadly a supposedly quick and defensive war would be. This brief, accessible text could easily be assigned in undergraduate courses. HNet, from which this listserv review is taken, is a listserv of history teachers, both college and secondary school teachers. In their introduction, Hedis and Anderson wrote that they hope to show the full range of Luxemburg's contributions by including, for the first time in one volume, substantial extracts from both her economic and political writings, and in this goal they have succeeded. The reader successfully shows the breadth of Luxemburg's scholarship. In addition to providing an important analysis of Marxist theory and revolutionary politics, the texts here are historically instructive regarding the ideological and political fractures in German social democracy before and during the First World War. As a major reference work on Luxemburg's life and thought, however, the reader does have some significant shortcomings. This is the question that I think the reviewer is just making a cheap shot, because I don't think that you can do both things necessarily in terms of providing, on the one hand, a major reference work, and the other that's kind of a guide for sort of pedagogical, a survey. While the introduction and endnotes evince an impressive familiarity with the secondary literature and provide useful historical context, this volume does not include a bibliography of either Luxemburg's complete works or relevant secondary sources. The editors have carefully culled the Luxemburg canon for the best of the work, yet it would have been helpful if they had noted what important work they had to leave out. A timeline of Luxemburg's life would also have been useful. Finally, the text has quite a few typos and other small errors, as we just saw with the 19th versus the 20th century. Especially frustrating is the mispagination over a large section of endnotes. These problems aside, the editors have done an admirable job of presenting Luxemburg's life and work in a form appropriate to both general and specialist audiences. The reader demonstrates that Luxemburg's thought and place in history are ripe for reappraisal and should help encourage what would be much welcomed new scholarship. And I do think actually there's probably a lot there. That it seems there's some texts that are worth considering. I put in bold here studies that explicitly or implicitly compare the hetero and Nama massacres or German colonialism generally to the Holocaust. And so there's a series of largely left texts from a variety of interesting places, a variety of presses, like Northwestern Press. They have a whole German thing, a history thing that they do, and historiography that is, the usual kind of post-colonial kind of thing. And so with that, I conclude with a mention. And if you haven't seen this film, it's a nice little film from the 1970s. It did win the Academy Award for Foreign Film in 76. And without giving you a spoiler of any kind, it does happen to just simply talk about the German colony and the French colony, French Equatorial Africa and Cameroon, I think, probably. And what happens when World War I starts and you have these two colonial peoples next to each other. So I include that as a nice little film to watch. It has a reasonable little ending. It is in the same genre of, people who sort of get along, have to declare war on each other, and chaos ensues or whatever. Okay, I think that covers all of the craziness I was going to cover, and we can get back to 34 counts of I got 34 counts counts of felony, and the Trump is anyway. So that's my little bit. If Joe is still listening, I think if there are questions, perhaps there are questions. Oh, the DA press statement, missed that. What else did I miss? Well, I guess not. Any other questions, brickbats, comments? We can.
Question about the really.
We can move on, I suppose.
Can you hear me, Ann?
Yeah. Oh, wait a second.
Is there anything in the historical record of the Nazis look back at the history of genocides? I know that recent studies have come out linking the Nazis to studying Jim Crow laws in the U.S.
Yeah, there's that excellent book on what the hell is it? It's a Yale book. It does the whole business on eugenics, and I just can't remember the title. It's a fairly good book, and I'm not sure, can't remember who the author is, but I think it's a Yale University Press book. Does the whole connection between Jim Crow and its study by Germans. It's an excellent book, and I probably have to hunt it down now, but I just don't have the title in front of me, but it's a recent book, and it does all the dirty work of showing how it's the tremendous connections between the Holocaust or from, etc. All of these things are there together, and going back to Ratzel as a German geographer, I think that's really important. A lot of geography served imperial purposes, and the history of geography is filled with a lot of imperial things. Mainly because it was mapping out, what are we going to take or control or whatever. That's really important shit. That's part of the history of geography. The mapping out conquest, in other words. Yes, indeed. Anybody else? I guess we can, Joe, we can shut this down. Let me thank you for your attention. I hope this was interesting. I think it, for me, was interesting because I didn't realize that there was a like that BBC thing on the Second Reich. I think that's really important, and it just shows this sort of continuity between all the issues of historical ethnicity, Lebensraum, which is a geographic idea clearly, and colonial conquest, which it has its continuity, and without getting into the long history of the Weimar Republic and the Reich, but you can see how it could be ingrained. A certain racialist kind of approach to things was clearly institutionally, there. It's not a new thing, and not that we're going to give the Nazis any slack on this, but you can see much broader connections to that. And if you look at it from an academic point of view, much of this does, I think it's Herzl, who, in terms of Zionism and anti-Semitism, it goes back to other German locales like Austria. An interesting book that you might want to read. It's a fairly old book, but it's an interesting book if you're interested in fin de siècle stuff. There's a book on of Wittgenstein's Vienna, which is really a nice, pleasant. It's the kind of book. Well, maybe it's the kind of book I would read on the beach, but probably you wouldn't read on the beach in the summer.
Like reading.
Anyone else?
Tomorrow. Frying rice outdoors.
Flying rice, flying lice.
Hopefully, if we're lucky, under the northern lights.
And so you're going to get
we're supposed to be getting the flare-ups.
It'll be interesting to see your super walk, fired up out there with the northern lights, right? I probably will talk about the pages 7 through 32 of it's the introduction to the Hoodis and Anderson book tomorrow at 5 p.m.